You look at your phone, nothing. Not empty, heavy. And somewhere inside you, a question you've been carrying for years without ever really asking it out loud. Why am I always alone? It's not that you haven't tried. You have. You showed up to the parties, you kept up conversations that meant nothing to you, you smiled at the right times, and still, there's something in you that just won't line up with the world that keeps getting handed to you. Like you're the wrong size for the spaces everyone else seems to fit into, just fine. Society has a quick answer for that. It tells you you're antisocial, that something's off with you, that if you're alone, it's because you failed the most basic test of being a human being, the one where you belong somewhere. But there's something society doesn't know about you, and Carl Jung spent a lifetime thinking about it. In 1921, Jung published Psychological Types, the work that laid the foundation for much of what we understand today about how the human psyche operates. In that book, Jung documented something that very few people were willing to say out loud, that there exists a minority of people whose psychological orientation makes them experience the social world very differently from the majority. Not because they're broken, not because they're damaged, but because they process their inner life in a way that the average social circle simply isn't built to meet. I'm not going to tell you that makes you better than anyone, but I will tell you it makes you different, in a way that has a name, has research behind it, and has specific consequences in your social life. When we use the term the rarest personality here, we are not referring to a diagnosis or an official category created by Carl Jung. It is an editorial expression we use to describe an uncommon combination of psychological patterns that some people may recognize in themselves. And having few friends does not by itself prove that someone possesses these traits. A person's social circle can become smaller for many different reasons: distance, life changes, mismatched schedules, personal loss, or simply the way time reshapes everything. What we are exploring today is a combination of patterns that some people may recognize in themselves. Today, we're going to look at 7 traits that show up with some consistency in people who describe having few friends or none, not because they can't connect, but because certain aspects of how they relate to the social world tend to create friction with the way most social environments are designed. And here's what I want to be honest about before we start. This isn't motivation. I'm not going to tell you being alone is easy, or that you should just embrace it and call it a day. What I'm going to do is offer a framework for thinking about why this keeps feeling the way it does, because understanding doesn't erase the weight of it, but it can change what the weight means. And that shift in meaning is where everything starts. The first trait is the one that makes people most uncomfortable when it surfaces, because it touches something most people would rather not look at. And it connects to what Jung called the persona. The persona, in analytical psychology, is what Jung described as a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual. He wrote that in Psychological Types in 1921. That's not a loose metaphor, it's a concrete psychic structure that every human being develops in order to function in the social world. The problem isn't having a persona. The problem is when the persona gets so dense, so polished, so convincing, that there's nothing left behind it, and some people see it. Okay, look, what's sometimes hard to explain is exactly this. How do you describe something that doesn't operate in conscious language? Actually, let me try a different way. Think about those work happy hours, those group hangs, those dinners where everybody's catching up. There's something you notice, right? A small glitch in the system. The moment someone laughs, but the laugh shows up a fraction of a second too late. The way someone's eyes lock onto nothing when they say they're fine. The almost invisible tension in the shoulders of whoever's insisting they don't care. You don't always analyze it. You feel it first. That kind of social sensitivity has been studied in cognitive psychology under the term thin slicing. The concept was documented by researcher Nalini Ambadi at Harvard University, and it refers to the ability to detect genuine patterns from extraordinarily narrow windows of experience. In her research, participants with higher interpersonal sensitivity showed greater accuracy in predicting the quality of an interaction from very brief observations. This is a real phenomenon, though it varies significantly between individuals, and the research doesn't tell us anything specific about people based on how many friends they have. Some people seem to register these social signals more readily than others. Not because they're specially gifted in a dramatic sense, but because people genuinely differ in how attuned their attention is to interpersonal cues. And for someone with that kind of sensitivity, ordinary social interaction can carry a disproportionate cognitive and emotional load in a way that people who don't experience it may not fully understand. What can this do to your social life? Something quite specific. When you enter a space where most people are operating from their persona, from their constructed social version, you may pick up on a great deal. The gap between what someone's saying and what their body is transmitting. The effort behind a calculated smile, the status dynamics running underneath the surface conversation. And then something strange happens. Because it's not that you're judging these people, it's that you simply can't not see it. And when you can't unsee the performance, participating in it takes an effort that can feel, at times, like working against your own wiring. From a Jungian perspective, people who are deeply identified with the persona may feel uncomfortable around someone who doesn't perform the same way. When someone has identified with their social mask for a long time, the presence of someone who doesn't wear theirs the same way can generate a kind of internal dissonance. They can't always name it. They just know something about you makes them uneasy. They call you hard to read. They call you intense. They say you think too much. Sometimes what that means is simply that you process social situations differently. And that difference is felt even when it can't be named. And that connects us to the second trait. There's a concept in psychology called need for cognition, formalized in the 1980s by researchers Cacioppo and Petty at Ohio State University. What that research documented is that there's significant individual variation in the degree to which people actively seek out complex thinking and find cognitive effort intrinsically rewarding. This isn't about intelligence in the IQ sense, it's about something closer to appetite. There are people who experience shallow conversation as a kind of deprivation, almost physical. If you're someone who has few friends, this may be part of the picture for you, though it's only one possible factor among many. What does it look like in practice? It means that when you sit down to talk with someone and the conversation stays on the surface without ever going deeper, something in you closes. Not out of arrogance, out of genuine mismatch. It's like trying to feed yourself with something that smells like food but has no actual nutrients. The body knows. Here's what I want to be clear about, because I think it matters. This doesn't mean people who enjoy lighter conversation are worth less than you. It means the structure of what actually feeds you, cognitively, emotionally, doesn't always line up with what most social settings offer. And that can create a very specific kind of loneliness, the loneliness of being surrounded by people but not being able to eat. Jung wrote about introversion not as a social preference, but as an orientation of psychic energy inward. In Psychological Types, he described how the introvert draws vitality from reflection, from internal feelings, from ideas and experiences that belong to the inner world. That's not shyness. That's not rejection. That's a different direction for the current of inner life. And when that direction runs into a social environment built primarily for extroversion, for status signaling and surface-level mutual validation, the result can be a disproportionate drain that some people mistake for social failure. It wasn't necessarily rejection. Some environments simply cost more than they could give. There's something developed from principles of inner observation and Jungian analytical psychology that was built specifically to work with this layer, not on an intellectual level, but as a daily practice. In the moment, it's actually happening. It's called the ORA method: observation, liberation, awareness. The ORA method is a structured self-reflection practice developed by our team and inspired by principles of inner observation. It is not therapy, does not diagnose psychological conditions, and is not a substitute for professional support. Its purpose is to offer a brief structure for observing thoughts, emotions, and personal patterns with greater awareness. 8 minutes a day, structured to work on exactly this layer of incompatibility. It's at theinnerexile.com. Page 6. That's where it begins. If this is landing somewhere, stay, because what comes next is the hardest part to sit with. The third trait connects to something Jung called the shadow, and I need to explain it in a way that's probably different from how you've heard it before, because the textbook definition is too clean to capture what actually happens in real social interactions. Picture everyone walking around with a locked storage unit they carry everywhere. Inside that unit is everything that person refuses to see about themselves, the fragilities they deny, the fears they converted into aggression, the envy they dressed up as criticism, the emptiness they cover with noise or achievements. They carry it everywhere, but they almost never see it. What they see instead is its reflection in other people. When someone whose storage unit is very full encounters you, something that Jungian psychology describes as projection can occur. You may become a kind of screen onto which they offload what they can't carry inside. Jung wrote clearly in 2 essays on analytical psychology that the shadow, when projected, tends to produce a disproportionate emotional response. The other person reacts not to who you actually are, but to what your presence activates in them. If you're someone with a low need for external validation, someone who can sit in silence without filling it, someone who doesn't constantly perform a heroic version of their own story, from a Jungian perspective, that kind of presence can activate what others haven't yet looked at in themselves. Your self-sufficiency may activate their awareness of their own dependence. Your silence may activate their inner noise. Your groundedness may activate their sense of their own void. And the shadow, when activated without self-awareness, can turn outward as aggression, as exclusion, as a comment that seems to come from nowhere, as being quietly frozen out of a group without having done anything visible. Jung's thinking here is worth sitting with. In his view, whoever has not confronted their own shadow tends to project its contents onto others and then react to that projection as though it were real. It's important to note this is a Jungian interpretive framework, not a proven causal mechanism for every conflict or exclusion. That means if you've been excluded, treated with hostility for no apparent reason, or had someone turn against you without clear cause, it's possible that dynamics of projection were at play. It's also possible that other factors were involved: misunderstandings, incompatibility, things neither of you could see clearly. Understanding the possibility of projection doesn't remove your own responsibility to look honestly at how you show up in relationships. The fourth trait is the one that costs me the most to explain because it sits right at the line between strength and real cost. And I think you need to hear both sides. In 1951, researcher Solomon Asch published the results of what we now call the Asch conformity experiments. What Asch demonstrated is that approximately 75% of participants, when facing social pressure that directly contradicted what their own eyes were showing them, gave the wrong answer that the group was giving. Not because they were unintelligent, but because the weight of social approval is, for most people, more powerful than direct perception of reality. If you recognize yourself in the remaining minority, those who held their own perception under group pressure, that's a real psychological trait worth understanding. But the Asch experiments measured behavior in a specific controlled setting, and we can't use them to place you definitively in a category based on your social life. What the research does tell us is that people vary significantly in how much social pressure shifts their judgments. And for people on the more independent end of that spectrum, certain social environments create a specific kind of friction. Groups that run on forced consensus, unchosen loyalty, or opinions adopted by tribal adhesion can feel genuinely uncomfortable. Not because of arrogance, but because an internal evaluation system that doesn't switch off under external pressure simply doesn't mesh with those dynamics. When did you last pretend to agree with something just to keep the peace in a group? You probably remember it, because you don't do it easily, and you probably also remember the cost, the look that came, the subtle cooling, the moment something shifted. Jung had a term for the opposite process, participation mystique, which he borrowed from ethnologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl. It's the state in which the individual dissolves their psychic boundaries and emotionally merges with the group, adopting its contents as their own without critical processing. In plain terms, it's what happens when a person loses themselves in herd logic. Some people can't fully do that. There's something in their psyche that maintains a minimum distance, an internal observation point that doesn't shut off even under heavy pressure. There's a more contemporary name for this, self-differentiation. And even though it sounds like a positive thing, and in many ways it is, it carries a real social cost. Groups that depend on participation mystique to function may push you out. Not always consciously. You just have no natural place in their dynamic. When people called you difficult, said you never really fit in, accused you of always having something to say against the grain. In some cases, they weren't describing a flaw. They were describing an incompatibility in how you and that particular group were structured. The fifth trait is the one that most quietly shapes your entire history, and it's also the hardest to see from the inside because it operates in time. Developmental psychology researchers have studied what's called temporal executive function, the capacity to mentally model long-term consequences and act from that model rather than from immediate impulse. And there's real individual variation in how far forward any given mind tends to plan and think. Research on decision-making does show that people vary considerably in their time orientation, some focusing more on immediate concerns, others on longer-term patterns and consequences. The specific framing of a universal 2 to 4 week horizon for most people is a simplification of more complex findings across different domains, but the underlying variation in temporal perspective is real and documented. If you tend to operate on a longer time horizon, you already know what that can feel like in a conversation, like trying to discuss navigation with someone working from a very different map. Not because they're less than you, but because you're oriented toward different scales of time. That can create a very particular loneliness. Not the loneliness of having no company, the loneliness of seeing where a road leads and not being able to make others see it at the same time. The loneliness of warning about something and not being heard until it's already happened. How many times have you seen something coming that nobody else seemed to notice? How many times did time prove you right about a decision, a person, a situation, when it was already too late for it to change anything. When the conversations in your social circle revolve around the drama of this week, what someone said in the group chat, plans for next weekend, and your head is processing patterns that will unfold over the next year, that distance isn't a personality flaw, it's a difference in temporal perspective. You can't easily compress your horizon without a real cost to yourself, and you can't always make others see yours. The sixth trait is the one most easily misread because it looks like something the current culture highly values: authenticity. But what I'm pointing at here isn't authenticity as an aesthetic. It's something more precise and more uncomfortable. Jung developed throughout his work the concept of individuation, which he defined as the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, a separate, indivisible unity or whole. It's not a state you arrive at. It's a process that runs the length of a life. And one of the things Jung observed in this process is a growing discomfort with what he called forced adaptation to the collective, the pressure to perform versions of ourselves that serve the group's expectations rather than our actual nature. Here's what this can look like. There are people who, in the process of genuinely knowing themselves, progressively lose the capacity to hold themselves in roles that don't match who they actually are. Each year that passes, the gap between the performed self and the actual self becomes harder to maintain. Each layer of the persona that falls away in the individuation process makes it harder to put back on. That means if you've been in a genuine inner process for years, you've probably noticed that certain friendships just didn't hold. Not because you fought, not because someone did something wrong, but because you kept growing and the dynamic between you depended on a version of you that doesn't exist anymore. From a Jungian perspective, individuation is not always compatible with relational stasis, and many social groups are, by design, systems that reward stability and create friction for authentic change. That's a real tension. It doesn't have an easy answer, and it's worth holding with some humility because growth and self-knowledge don't automatically make someone easier to be around. What it does have is a direction. Inward first. Always inward first. If you want to keep understanding these patterns, the ones operating below what's normally visible, stay. There's still a lot we haven't opened. The seventh trait is the one that most directly confronts something the self-help industry constantly tries to dissolve: the real discomfort with emotional dependency on external sources. There's a term in flow psychology developed by researcher Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi across decades of studying optimal experience that describes a specific type of personality: the autotelic personality. It's the person who finds reward and meaning inside the activity itself, not in whatever external recognition it generates. What's interesting about that concept is how it connects to something Jung observed from a different angle. As individuation deepens, a person can develop what Jung called a relationship with the Selbst, the self with a capital S, that gradually reduces dependence on external validation for a sense of meaning. This isn't something Jung presented as a fixed personality type, but as a direction of psychological development. In practical terms, there are people who seem to need less external affirmation to feel grounded, not as a claim of superiority, as a description of how they're oriented. That orientation has real social consequences because most social bonds run on an economy of emotional reciprocity. I validate you, you validate me. We give each other a reason to keep showing up together. When someone doesn't enter that economy, not because they consciously reject it, but because they genuinely don't need it the same way, the group can experience them as strange, unreachable, cold even. It's not coldness. It may be a kind of self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency in a world built on mutual dependency as its social glue, can make people deeply uncomfortable. How many times have you been told you're distant, that you don't give much, that you seem like you don't need anyone, probably with a mixture of accusation and something that looked a lot like envy, even though nobody would call it that? From a Jungian perspective, there's a dynamic worth understanding here. When someone who depends heavily on external validation encounters someone who doesn't need it the same way, what can arise is a kind of reverse projection. The other person sees in you what they want for themselves, and that desire transformed into an unconscious dynamic can become aggressiveness or withdrawal. In some relationships built on approval or control, your independence may have created real tension. In others, the distance may have come from reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. Both are possible. Now, look at these 7 traits together for a moment. You may see the social performance when it's happening. You may need cognitive depth to feel genuinely fed. You may activate shadow projection in people operating without self-awareness. You may find it costly to dissolve into group logic. Your time horizon may create real distance from people living entirely in the immediate present. The individuation process may have pulled you away from dynamics that depended on an older version of you, and your inner self-sufficiency may not fit easily into the mutual validation economy that most people use as their relational foundation. That's not necessarily a sociability problem. It may be a genuine mismatch between how you're built and how many social environments are designed, but there's something I need to say here that sometimes gets left out of this kind of analysis because leaving it out would do you real damage. Incompatibility is not a virtue by itself. When you finally find a framework that explains why you're alone, there's a temptation to settle into it, to use the incompatibility as a shield against continuing to grow, to convert the trait into a fixed identity instead of a description of a process. The individuation Jung describes doesn't lead to an ivory tower. It leads to a form of presence in the world that's more authentic and, over time, more capable of real connection. Not more connections, deeper connection. The difference is enormous, and growth also means looking honestly at where you may have contributed to distance, where your perception of others may have been projection, where your self-sufficiency may have become a wall rather than a foundation, where your depth requirement may have become an excuse not to show up for the simpler, messier parts of being in relationship with people. What's happening during the period of greatest loneliness isn't that you no longer need people. It's that you haven't yet found someone who can find you. And part of the work of that loneliness is becoming someone who is possible to find. Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." That's something many people living with these patterns experience. It's not the absence of people that hurts, it's the absence of people who can hold the actual weight of what you carry inside. That's something you work on. Not overnight, not with a course or a social skills tutorial, with the kind of practice that goes inward before trying to connect outward. Because what you don't know about yourself inevitably gets projected onto others. And projection, as we've seen, doesn't produce connection. It produces distance wearing the costume of a relationship. The ORA method was built for exactly this work. 8 minutes a day of observation, liberation, awareness, building the capacity to be with what's inside before trying to share it outward. Not meditation, not therapy. A structured self-reflection practice developed by our team and inspired by principles of Jungian analytical psychology. You'll find it at theinnerexile.com. Here's what I want to leave you with. These 7 traits are not a certificate for anything. They're a framework for thinking about a particular kind of inner architecture, one that carries real costs, and that, if worked consciously, also carries real possibilities. Enantiodromia, a principle Jung develops in psychological types, describes how any extreme pushed too far eventually becomes its opposite. The person who pushes self-sufficiency too far ends up in an isolation that looks a lot like dependency, just without anyone nearby. The person who pushes rejection of the superficial too far ends up unable to inhabit the ordinary spaces where life also happens. The work isn't to get rid of these traits, it's to integrate them, so that your sharp perception of others coexists with the capacity to accept that people operate from where they are, not from where they could be, so that the need for depth coexists with tolerance for the lighter moments that also carry value, so that your inner self-sufficiency coexists with a real openness to being found. That's not something a video teaches you. It's something you learn in the daily practice of looking at yourself with the same honesty you bring to looking at everyone else. If what you heard today landed somewhere, not as comfort but as recognition, drop it in the comments. Not the trait, the moment, the specific situation where you felt the incompatibility we talked about. Because what those moments have in common across people from completely different cultures and contexts says something about the human psyche that we haven't finished understanding. Knowing why you're alone is the beginning. What to do with that from the inside out is a different conversation, one we're already building.